Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be focused on governance and compliance for the Alliance. Feel free to ask any questions throughout the training. This is an interactive training, and so I am going to ask folks to participate as we go through the training. We do have two scenarios. Based on the numbers today, we might only do one, but those scenarios are only as effective if we all participate in them. And so I just wanted us to just take a moment just to arrive for the training. So if you do have anything that you'd like to offload, if you see this little tower here, you can go ahead and add the rock in your head just to offload those things so that you could come in and join us today. We'll take about 2 seconds to do that. All right, thank you. So today's Compass, this is where we're headed today. We're going to talk a little bit about nonprofit governance. We're also going to look at board fiduciary duties. We're going to talk a little bit about legal and compliance essentials. We're also going to look at the types of nonprofit boards that are out there that exist. We're going to spend some time looking at a case study on I called it the governance challenge. And then we're also going to spend some time talking about some best practices around board governance and compliance, as well as board engagement. And so just a quick reminder as we begin, a small group of thoughtful people could change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So we are a mighty group here. You all are a mighty group. So let us go ahead and get focused. Today's learning objectives are 3 main objectives: to explain the key principles of nonprofit governance and how they impact board decision making. We will also focus on defining the roles and responsibilities of board members and apply them to real-world governance scenarios. So we have 2 scenarios to work through today.
And finally, we will analyze compliance requirements and fiduciary duties to ensure ethical and legal board governance.
Board members have. And those have to do with strategic oversight and mission alignment, fiduciary responsibility and financial oversight, compliance and risk management, executive director oversight and leadership support, as well as policy development and governance best practices. What that looks like in actuality as you go throughout your role as being board members is really, when it comes to strategic oversight and mission alignment, is ensuring that your organization's activities align with its mission, vision, and values. You are also focused on setting long-term strategic priorities and monitoring their implementation. And finally, regularly reviewing your programs and initiatives to ensure that they advance the organization's goals. When it comes to fiduciary responsibility and financial oversight, you're going to be responsible for approving budgets, reviewing financial statements, and ensuring fiscal sustainability. I encourage you, if you were not at the Finance 101 session, to go ahead and spend some time after this session reviewing the details of that session. There's some good, valuable information in there, even about how the Alliance operationalizes its finances, establishes and enforces internal financial controls to prevent fraud and mismanagement. And finally, as board members, you are ensuring that the nonprofit is using funds ethically and legally in accordance with donor restrictions and grant requirements. When it comes to compliance and risk management, you're really focused on ensuring compliance with federal, state, and local laws. So you're focused on the IRS 501c3. Everybody knows that, or you've heard of that. And you're also focused on employment laws. You're overseeing policies of conflicts of interest, whistleblower protections, and document retention. And finally, you're identifying and mitigating operational, reputational, and legal risks that could impact the organization. And when it comes to executive director oversight and leadership support, you're hiring, evaluating, and supporting your executive director. You're providing strategic guidance and mentorship while allowing your leadership to manage the daily operations. And finally, you're conducting an annual performance evaluation on your executive director to really ensure that you have strong and effective leadership for your organization. And finally, when it comes to policy development and governance of best practices, you are establishing and maintaining bylaws, governance policies, and board member expectations. And finally, you're conducting board self-assessments and providing training for continuous improvement like we are today. You're ensuring board diversity and inclusion, fostering a governance structure that reflects the communities that you serve, which in this essence, you're serving the entire nation and doing some really impactful work. Are there any questions before we continue? Sometimes we hear about like board fiduciary duties, and what are those? So there's three main ones. You have a duty of care, you have a duty of loyalty, and you have a duty of obedience. When I talk about duty of care, I'm really talking about acting with reasonable care, diligence in making decisions for the organization. This means you're staying informed, you're attending meetings, you're reviewing materials, and most importantly, you're reviewing financial reports before the actual board meeting. When I say you have a duty of loyalty, you're always acting in the best interest of the organization. And sometimes that means you have to put your needs above your own, the needs of the organization above your own. You want to avoid conflicts of interest. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that conflict of interest is. Ashley has done a really good job of making sure everybody received the conflict of interest and signed it even before you began your positions as board members. You should always act in the best interest of the organization and avoid conflicts of interest. And so I implore you to disclose any potential conflicts of interest before you actually vote during board meetings. You also have a duty of obedience, which is to really follow the bylaws and the mission of the organization. Understand what the legal requirements are for the contracts that you're signing, and making sure that you approve policies that align with those legal requirements. Any thoughts? Oh my gosh, you guys are hardcore. Everybody's just looking. Okay. All right. A governance-focused board safeguards the organization's compliance, preventing legal risks and ensuring a long-term sustainability. How do you do that? You are always making sure in your role that the organization remains 501c3 compliant. What that means for an organization is really that they operate exclusively for exempt purposes. You avoid political campaigning, and you ensure proper financial reporting. So your Form 990 is due. You need to make sure that that gets submitted. That should be an agenda item. You want to make sure that funds are used in alignment with your mission and that you are able to maintain your tax-exempt status. What that looks like is oversight of mission alignment, financial accountability, and also regulatory compliance and executive oversight. When I say you need to be aware of conflicts of interest, I'm really talking about what occurs when a board member, staff, or key stakeholder has a personal, financial, or professional interest that could interfere with their ability to act in the best interest of your nonprofit. This can lead to biased decision-making, loss of public trust, and even legal violations if not properly managed. And here are some examples of conflicts of interest. When I talk about financial gain, I'm talking about a board member voting towards a contract to a company they own or are employed by. That's a big no-no. Personal relationships. A nonprofit hires the executive director's relative without a fair hiring process. And finally, holding dual roles. A board member also serving as a paid consultant of that organization. Those are some conflicts of interest. Can you all maybe think of any other conflicts of interest that you maybe have seen or heard about? Or any thoughts on the ones that I've shared?
Well, I will, Dr. Keisha, my heart is going out to you. I know what it is to be a presenter and nobody's engaging. So here I am.
Thank you.
I think right now we are in a discussion, as the Alliance about conflict of interest around personal relationships and dual roles. So I'm looking forward to, hearing your discussion to support us, because we had a conversation maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago where we're discussing how our work outside of the Alliance could possibly represent a conflict of interest with us serving the Alliance.
Ooh, interesting. And so what are some thoughts around that?
I don't have specific thoughts on that, but to piggyback off of Yolanda, I'm in Arizona and I'm also part of the Arizona Association. So just thinking about partnerships, from our meeting yesterday, we were talking about how to build the alliance. And so a conflict of interest kind of came up in my mind of, do I give this partnership to the AZ Alliance? Do I bring it to the national? Like, we're working on a national level, but we're also working in our own states. So thinking about that, it's not a traditional conflict of interest, but something that I've been thinking about.
Awesome. What are other folks' thoughts about that? Let's help Katie think through that.
I think about the fact that dual roles exist in so many spaces, and there's not often the pause that should be to really think about or have discussions about whether or not they are problematic. So I think it's a subject, conflict of interest is a subject that definitely you have to explore as a board member, while still just understanding that this is a small world. The infant and early childhood mental health world is small, and so there will undoubtedly be relationships across, different spaces or within different spaces. But, again, I think that there just needs to be continued conversation about when there's a conflict of interest, if there is, and what to do about it, which speaks then to the need for policies around such things, policies around what the process will be of exploring conflict of interest, not just a conflict of interest statement or form that's signed, but what's the process of exploring a possible conflict of interest.
And so I think, and that is something I remember when I initially started working with you all and I saw that, and that was a question of mine. And so I would encourage you that now that you all as a group have decided that you want to sort of work through that, I would say have a focused conversation on what does that look like. I'll tell you my first recommendation would be that, and I'm going to use Katie's example for the context of this conversation, right? But let's say you were on a contract that was coming out of, say, Arizona. You said you were in Arizona, right, Katie? So if it was a contract for Arizona, Katie might recuse herself from that vote. So that way her no vote or her yes vote or her abstaining vote doesn't truly affect the process that's there. Does that sort of explain? Does that resonate well with folks? But what has to happen at that meeting when that conflict arises is Katie then needs to say explicitly why she is recusing herself from the vote. And that needs to be documented. So that when somebody sees it. Oh, yes, go ahead.
as you talk about the conflict of interest, I guess what's resonated for me, to be clear, when we think about board members awarding contract, another example could be like, let's say my aim as a financial gain. Is there a financial gain when we're voting in the midst of all these different things regarding licensing? So my aim needs to recuse themselves from the vote or not show up.
Well, I wouldn't say not show up, right? Because if you're having a board meeting, you're also conducting other business. And so the board member, because remember, if we go back, everybody has 3 duties. So you sign this knowing you have those 3 duties. So when you're having a board meeting, I wouldn't say board members don't show up because there's a vote on there that they need to recuse themselves. They just need to recuse themselves at that voting time. And
No, I didn't mean it that way. I'm sorry.
Okay,
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. So they would not show up. They would recuse themselves when you get to that item and not vote on that item. They also may not. Go ahead.
Dr. Keisha, then I have a question about a policy I don't know if I'm saying policy, we just shifted our bylaws, right? Mm-hmm. Where specifically around my aim, we've asked them to not be present when we are discussing things around my aim. I'm asking this for a clarification point. So are you saying that they should have still been able to be present while we are in the conversation, even if the conversation was around something where they stand to have financial gain, but the only recusal is the actual voting itself?
So again, and I'm not a lawyer, so okay. I would say for updating your bylaws, I would reach out to my legal person to say, hey, here's what I'm thinking about doing. Because you don't want to change your bylaws because of one situation. Because your bylaws is there to protect you over all situations. And so you might ask your lawyer, how do I handle this situation? But in actuality, right? Like if you are having a board meeting, you wouldn't ask a board member not to attend that board meeting if the board member was a regular attendee. But what you could do is maybe form a subcommittee, a working group, and that working group work on an initiative. And I'm not just discussing the My Aim situation. I really think with the My Aim situation, I would encourage you to seek the guidance of a lawyer for that specificity, because all board members have a fiduciary responsibility to the organization. Did I answer the question or did I just make it really worse?
No, you answered my question, but you've given me more questions now. And I think that maybe Maylene or Ashley can speak to this more, because we just had a full conversation where my aim is removing themselves from the board or discussing removing themselves from the board because I believe they felt that to ask them to recuse themselves from our conversation or our discussion time. And I was specifically thinking about Danielle saying, well, who's going to fill us in on the stuff that we missed if we aren't at the board meeting because this is a board meeting y'all don't want us at? So, Dr. Keisha, you've actually given me more questions now, because now I'm concerned if we should have even touched the bylaws versus having this knowledge prior to everything we've done, which has led us down the road where we have a My Aim person who resigned. We have 2 My Aim people who had some discussions with us where they're leaning towards resignation from the board. Like, this is snowballed into some other things, I think, just because we didn't have this information that you're giving us today. So Maylene, Ashley, I could be wrong, so please correct me or add to or take away from.
I can share some information that might not clarify, but that might be useful to know, which is that we are in a very unique situation in that my aim has been written into our bylaws. So it's not a separate sort of thing that we're adding out of an issue that it's arising, but their presence on the board is written as 3 seats.
Okay.
The governance committee has been working, I want to say for the past 4-5 months on rethinking our bylaws and finding gaps in them. So the recusal policy is part of the work that the governance committee has been doing in determining different gaps and policies that are not written.
Awesome. I like that. So you're on the right track.
But can I interject 1 second? But to Yolanda's point, I think there was a misunderstanding. We didn't say in the meeting for them not to be at the board meeting. I think they were choosing not to be at the entire board meeting, because we said to them they could be at the board meeting, but when there's a vote, that there's a conflict of interest, we're only asking them to recuse themselves. So we just want to clarify that. That's what governance had agreed to do.
So I think you all are in a unique situation. I would recommend continue those focused conversations in cleaning it up, right? Because as your organization has grown, when you started, maybe, and again, I'm not offering any recommendations. So maybe there was a need to have 3 seats. But now as your organization has grown from a $30,000 organization to a $150,000 organization, maybe there's some things that are in the bylaws that are not necessarily serving the organization because of your growth or your projected growth. And so I would encourage you to continue those conversations and to make sure that you're consulting with a legal advisor as you make those decisions. Good questions, and I enjoyed the conversation. So when you think about your role in managing conflicts of interest, you need to make sure that you have implemented a conflict of interest policy, that you require and complete annual disclosures, that you recuse yourself from decision making, which you have personal or business gain from, you document the review, and that you always upload your fiduciary duty. A well-managed board proactively identifies, as you're doing, those conflicts of interest and mitigating conflicts to maintain ethical governance and public trust. Any thoughts? Awesome. So let's talk about bylaws. We got there even before we got there. So your bylaws are the governing rules that define how a nonprofit operates, including board structure, decision-making processes, officer roles, and conflict resolution procedures. They serve as the foundation for governance, accountability, and compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. You're based in Michigan, so you would follow like the Michigan Association of Nonprofit. They do have some guidance, so I would even encourage you to get familiar with that as well. Risk management. Risk management is the process of identifying, assessing, and mitigating risks that could threaten a nonprofit's financial health, legal compliance, or reputation. It helps ensure long-term sustainability and operational security. What your role looks like is legal and regulatory compliance, financial oversight, crisis preparedness, insurance and liability protections, and policy enforcement. Bylaws and risk management in a nonprofit do come together. So while your bylaws govern your rules and define how your board operates, when they come together, that's when we begin to talk about governance versus management. So when we talk about governance, we're talking about oversight and strategy. And when we're talking about management, we're talking about daily operations. As a board, where do you think you sit?
We're governors.
Anybody else?
I think we're working on being, we are a governance board and we're working on being governance because after the crisis, we really stepped into management. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. Board oversight is actually ensuring that the nonprofit is operating effectively, ethically. This does not mean that you all are running the day-to-day operations. That is the role of your executive director. You are ensuring mission alignment. So whatever you do, you want to make sure that every decision that you make for board oversight looks at financial expenditure and supports the organization's core mission and strategic goals. Your financial stewardship looks like you're doing board reviews of the budget, and you're also approving budgets as a board. You're continuously managing the financial health, and you're asking the tough questions about sustainability. How much longer do we have before the grant ends? How much longer do we have before we have to reapply again for this grant? Those are the kinds of conversations you all can ask as a board. Go ahead, Yolanda.
Dr. Keisha, I'm so glad you see me. Okay, so help me with this one. Because we are having conversations about how to generate revenue. We're having conversations about fundraising and all of that. Now, I'm inferring based on what you're saying, that technically is Ashley's job because she is management. Here's my caveat though. However, we can use our personal resources, relationships, time, talent, but the actual finding money, creating the fundraising, that sounds that is more management than governance. Please give me clarity if I'm incorrect.
So you can create, as a board, which includes Ashley, financial goals. So you may create a goal for the year to raise $500, right? Ashley might then go back and say, or you may come up with, as a board, 5 things you want to do around that during your annual planning time, right? But then Ashley takes that vision and she runs with it with her team. If she needs your help, she'll come back and say what it is and how it needs to be operationalized. But then you also are there to support. So yes, you are using your personal relationships to then support your So for example, Ashley and her team come up with this amazing fundraising campaign to raise $500,000 to do training in New Hampshire, right? As board members, you do have a role in that. You're sharing that fundraising goal. Maybe you're showing up to an event, and you may be a really passionate board member who wants to say, okay, can I help you to maybe decide what flowers to put on the table? Then yes, you can lend your resources where that is, but you are not the day-to-day planner of that event, unless, of course, you volunteer for that role. But it is not an expectation that you are managing the day-to-day things that happen for the organization, but you do have a role to assist.
Okay, so I understand plan assist, Dr. Keisha. Now I'm going to say this very explicitly. So we had a meeting yesterday where we were discussing sustainability and fundraising, fund development, something. Mm-hmm. What I hear you saying is sustainability is the governance part, but the fundraising, fund development, all of that is management, which is not our responsibility. Again, we can support with time, talent. Ashley comes back and say, hey, we're working on it. My team is working on this. We need you, but that's not our responsibility.
I don't know exactly what responsibility was being assigned, but you are providing oversight. Ashley has a responsibility to come back at each board meeting and let you know how the fundraising goals are going. And then based on your intellect and your passion, you might say, hey, have you thought about doing A, B, C, or D? But 5 days a week, providing her ongoing support for the fundraising goal is not necessarily your role. Go ahead.
I guess one of the things is I think we got lost because we already know that I think how the alliance is set up. I think there's something in Ashley's about fundraising, right? But I think it got lost with the sustainability piece. The sustainability piece, as a committee, we could also help with fundraising. It's not that we're taking on, I think the clarity needs to be around that. It's not that we're taking on the financial fundraising piece, but we could actually help with the fundraising piece as a committee to see what are some of the strategic partners and what are some other ways, or even as board members to say, okay, this is how I'm going to leverage my relationship that way. Or even, let's say you have a board member who is very wealthy. Okay, so I know X, Y, and Z here. I'm contributing this to the board as part of fundraising.
I'll give you a quick example, right? I was helping a client the other day, and 2 clients. I gave them both the same strategy to help them to apply for a grant. But I am not an employee of their company. So I cannot go representing their company for something. They now have a responsibility to enact the strategy. But if they need help, or as a result of what happens when they enact the strategy, I can provide them with recommendations, but I cannot represent their organization. You all as board members do represent the alliance. However, you are not managing the day-to-day. You're not the one who will go to, for example, a staff member and say to the staff member anything about their performance. If you have a concern about their performance, who would you go to?
Ashley.
Yeah.
So here's my I wonder question that I guess as a new board member I'll pose. Maylene, I'm specifically thinking to you and Ashley. I wonder if because of the crisis, there was this intersectionality that was created between governance and management, and have we considered having conversations about how to bifurcate again so that we are more in governance than we are in management? That's my I wonder statement.
I would say that for me, the answer is yes. We definitely had board members looking for grants, coordinating with people, trying to apply. So there was a lot of stepping into management, and I think bringing Dr. Gray on board is our attempt, our hope, our saving grace to really be a diligent governance board.
And that's the piece, right? Because you all are passionate about this. And so that's the pieces in setting those boundaries. And so even having a pointed conversation on that transition back to true governance. What does that truly look like? And hearing from your staff that represent you on a day-to-day basis, what do they need to support them? Because yes, as a board member, you can find a grant and you can say, hey, Ashley, this is a really great grant. Help me to here's a great grant opportunity. Is this something that would align? And Ashley might review it and then bring it back to the board and say, okay, here's a grant that's coming out of Arizona, and I'm sorry for picking on Arizona, but we would like to apply for that grant. This is actually a really good example. Now, when you all go to vote on that, whether or not you apply, Katie is sitting over here and she knows her organization is actually going to apply for it. So what Katie's going to do, she's going to recuse herself from that vote, and you all are going to decide as a board whether or not you go after that grant. Because now you're going to be competing with Katie. You might then say, and I just did this with another client, she's applying for a grant, I'm supporting her grant writing process, and I need board input because a lot of foundations now, they're not giving money if the board isn't helping. What's your board role? How much is your board giving before we give you money? So we did create a document that we sent to the board to ask how can they help with sustainability of the grant after winning. And many board members responded around stakeholder engagement, connecting them with opportunities for space, connecting them with partners. So that still is a role that as a governing board member, you can still play. But when it comes to sealing the deal, you can't seal the deal as a board member. Ashley needs to go out, get something to come back, and then all 19 of you vote on it. Did I muddy the water, or did that make sense? And that's where that delineation comes from. So again, identifying and mitigating risks related to legal compliance, operations, and reputation. That's your risk management. Supporting your executive director and accountability. So you're hiring, evaluating, and supporting your ED, but you don't manage them per se. The ED is responsible for operations, while the board ensures accountability and strategic direction. In terms of policy development, you're helping to establish clear policies that guide how the nonprofit is run and ensures compliance with laws and regulations. Everybody hears what everything's happening right now. Every day you get up, it's something that is changing. That is the economy and the constant state of our community right now. And so will you need to have emergency meetings during this time? You might need to have them, but you have to always go back to what your voting bylaws say. And if it says a quorum at a board meeting, then you need to call a board meeting and have a vote. Or maybe you create a way for an electronic voting process in lieu of a meeting. But you have to make sure that whatever votes are taking place, they're taking place in accordance with your bylaws. I hope I didn't muddy waters, because you are a working board. So let's talk about board strategy, right? So as a board members, you are responsible for the long-term vision and not just reacting to immediate concerns. So that looks like setting long-term priorities, 3 to 5 year strategic goals. You're monitoring impact and outcomes. You're evaluating whether programs and initiatives are achieving the intended outcomes. So are you getting a monthly program report from Ashley? And Ashley, I'm only using your name because you are here. This is not to say Ashley is doing anything or not doing it. You're adapting to change. So you're reviewing industry trends and external factors that may impact your work. And you're making and adjusting your strategy accordingly. We just did a grant proposal and we spent probably about 2 hours removing anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is just something that you probably are going to have to spend some time doing as an organization. to remain operational for now. Strengthening your partnerships. You're expanding relationships with funders, community stakeholders, and policymakers to enhance sustainability and influence. So very practical. As a board member, that is why you're never just taking a $500 donation from Kate. You're taking that $500 cash and then you're going to turn it over to Ashley. We're not doing that. You should have some kind of online system, or you're connecting Ashley with Katie so Ashley can go ahead and get that money. You got to make sure that you are withholding and that you are protecting yourself. You need to support revenue generation by identifying sustainable funding sources without overstepping into operational tasks. So you can't accept that grant from a foundation on your own. Your board can, so all 19 of you can vote on accepting that money. But Maylene herself can't say yes to the Community Foundation of Arizona that she's going to take this $500,000. You all, as a board, have to make that decision. Thoughts? Why are you laughing?
Maylene is taking the money and run out.
I can use $500,000.
That's why I'm laughing. We all can.
So let's talk about board oversight and staff management and what that looks like. So the staff is developing and managing the budget daily. But as a board, you're approving the budget and ensuring financial health. And during Finance 101, your consultant gives you some questions that you can ask and let you know where documents are. And I'm pulling a blank right now, but actually, what is the resource called where all the financial stuff is?
Basecamp?
Thank you, Basecamp. Ashley has done a really good job. So everything is on Basecamp. So if you've not gone over to Basecamp and went into that finance folder, I encourage you to do so. As a board, you're setting long-term strategic direction. But then Ashley and her team are implementing the programs and services on a daily basis. You're setting strong, long-term strategic direction, and Ashley is responsible for supervising and hiring staff daily. But you hire your ED. You're evaluating your executive director. Ashley is ensuring that policies are followed in daily work. You're establishing policies for accountability. The team is making sure, Ashley's making sure that policies are followed in daily work. As a board, you're ensuring compliance and risk management. Ashley and her team are handling legal filings, HR, and internal procedures. Go ahead, Ashley.
Can I give us a real world scenario?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think I would benefit from further discussion or maybe parameters around SET's long-term strategic direction. I feel like historically I've been with this organization 10 years, and I feel like both when I was have been in this role and then when I wasn't, that one kind of feels a little bit more elusive, and I've experienced it getting thrown around in a way that feels like, is that like power grab that the board is kind of like weighing in on that, or is that truly long-term? Like, how do we define long-term strategic direction? So that's my bigger question. The real world example of this is you brought up the diversity, equity, and inclusion limits on language right now. And so our team is very active and passionate and dedicated to this work, specifically as it pertains to DEI. And so they have a lot of thoughts and feelings and suggestions about how the Alliance pivots itself as an organization who does continue to carry out DEI. I, though, also know that the board needs to weigh in on that, and that there's the DEI committee of the board, and that they're ultimately going to be making larger recommendations to the full board. But how do these intersect? Do I become the voice that represents the team and how the team is thinking about these things? Is this not an example of long-term strategic direction? What do you think about my example? This feels like a bit of a crisis.
So I think one of the things that's important, especially around, so if you set some long-term goals in June of last year, come January of this year, if you're a nonprofit, you've had to print it, right? If you set some long-term goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you use those words, for example, in June of last year, come January of this year, if you want to remain, you've had to think about rewording and even developing different strategies. So that's the reality of it. As a board, you might say, Ashley, can you come to us with some recommendations? Her and her team will go back and then come to you with some recommendations. That's the day-to-day management. When they come back to it, you as a board might then retweak or rework the organizational goals based on their recommendations. You might say yes to 2, you might say no to 1, and then her and the team have to go back and come back with something. Or you may say as a board, during a regular board meeting, we would like to revisit our 6 goals that we have as for the organization. And then you go into a planning session to come out with that. But again, that has to go back to the full board for final vote. Did I just make sense?
I think so. I would like to hear what you have to share, Harleen.
Keisha, to Ashley's point, with the example that Ashley gave with the DEI stuff, right? When we think about long-term strategic direction, the example that Ashley gave and the response that you gave her seems more like short-term to me, personally. So when we think long-term, right? We're thinking about, okay, DEI. I'm going to use 2020 as an example. 2020, we had to shift stuff, right? But if we were thinking long-term, 5 years from 2020, if we had done some long-term strategic thinking and planning, we wouldn't be at this place. So I guess moving forward, how do we do long-term strategic plan to make sure that whatever we're doing with DEI is not a as the moment fix solution that we're giving folks, but it's a long-term range, so we don't have to keep coming back and fixing stuff.
So
I want to know your thoughts on that.
So some of my recommendations actually include, and this is going to sound, I am not recommending that people change goals because our communities have not changed. A lot of times they may need more right now, but what you might need to do is some language adjustment. So instead of explicitly saying some things and using diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're grounding some of those goals in larger context. So let me go back. I'm going to give you an example of a language change.
As you look for that, I think,
go ahead.
Just sticking with this example, the Alliance doesn't presently, nor have we ever, to be fair, received federal funding. So the Alliance was not one of the organizations that needed to immediately scrub everything to the way that some of our national partners had to a few weeks ago. So what I'm hearing internally from our team is, do we have the benefit then of being a little bit more strategic and intentional about how we approach DEI rather than just scrubbing everything because we don't personally feel that federal pressure in the same way. And so rather than just like hurrying through it, can we just be really intentional? And then that's the tension of like that I'm seeking is where does the board get to guide that and where does the team get to weigh in, knowing that we don't receive federal dollars. If that were to change tomorrow, obviously that's a different story. But as of today, we don't. And so we have a little bit of a less structured situation.
So I'll answer that question two ways. So one, you don't receive federal funds right now, but you do have goals to receive. So you got to get your house ready. And in order to get your house ready, that might mean you have to do some scrubbing. And so you can't get your house ready tomorrow to receive federal dollars, because now you should be at the partnership development phase. So you're going out there, you're having conversations, you're passing out brochures about the alliance, you're telling the alliance's story, and your partners are going to your website to get that information. So is that something that's important to you right now? Yes, especially because you have 53 organizations, 51, did I get that right? 51 member orgs that report to that. How many?
38.
Huh?
38.
38. So you have 38 other organizations who may receive federal funds. And so, but you're providing leadership and capacity support to them. And so when they tell their story to their funders, they may be also talking about the alliance. So while you're not a direct receiver, they are using funds that they receive potentially from the federal government to pay you. So you do have a responsibility there. Did that answer the question around that? You're muted.
But I'm a hand talker, so you could tell I was trying to say something. I said, big picture, yes, that is helpful. I appreciate that feedback. And then still on a smaller scale, I guess I'm trying to imagine like the Venn diagram of like the team and the board working together and just really using this as an example. And so I appreciated you saying like, I could gather the team's input and bring it, and then there could be some back and forth. We've never really formalized that. And so I still like, when is that one of these moments? So I guess that's something that I would just like to practice.
So I would say,
Maylene, like how can we practice this as we move forward?
So I would say that should be a regular practice as a governing board. And so I can give an example of a local quasi-government entity here, right? Like we as a team, when I worked there, we brought recommendations to the board. We brought funding recommendations to the board, but the board ultimately had the final say in whether or not organizations were funded. And so as a team, you can bring recommendations to the board as to how you would like to move forward. But then the board is going to say yes or nay. And that should be a regular occurrence at board meetings. For your DEI subcommittee, you're still not focused I'm not even going to use that committee, but all your subcommittees are still focused on governance, governing the organization. The day-to-day stuff is still the team. It's still that small team. If you're staying as a governing board, you might say, hey, we can't be a governing board anymore. We need to go back to being a working board. And then your practices need to align. So I think you're on the right track, because now you're recognizing sort of what are some of those gaps as an organization. And so like Ashley said, what are those places where we should be doing that? What are those places where we should be bringing recommendations versus asking for day-to-day management stuff? And I think that's where you all need to come together and identify some of those things. And then, yes, Ashley, put them into practice, because bad practice becomes habit. So in the state of Florida, if 2 board members are going to show up somewhere and they're a government entity, it has to be what's known as sunshined, because there's a potential for a decision to happen there. And everything must be sunshined. So there's sometimes where 2 board members don't even show up at things just out of the fear of like attending something and somebody thinking that means a decision is being made. That's just an example. I'm not saying you guys need to go there. I was just giving an example. Thoughts? You good? So the example I would give here is regularly reviewing programs and initiatives to ensure they advance the organization goals. That used to say something about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I changed it because it is important to recognize that if you regularly review program data, you will make adjustments based on what the data is telling you. And if you do that, it informs your strategy and it informs where you're going. Does that make sense? In layman terms, you're disaggregating your data. So you're still employing the same things we advocated for when we did diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because if you disaggregate your data, it's still going to tell you who's better off and who's not better off. And if you look at your data and it tells you A, then that is what you use to substantiate the work that you're doing versus a blanket conversation around something else. Use your data to talk for you. Did I just muddy the water for anyone? Good? Awesome. So we're at the 1 hour mark, and I do recognize when we're doing online trainings that we do need a break. So we are going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back and to continue. Okay? All right. See you all back in 5 minutes. We'll just wait for everybody else to come back. As folks come back, if you're ready to go, just turn your camera on and we'll continue. Or make a note in the chat. I'm not forcing anybody to come on camera. But it does make us feel closer. Awesome. So let's go ahead and get started. Well, restarted. All right. Oops. Oh no. Yes, we did. We're at bylaws, right? We did risk, did this, we did this. All right. Awesome. Scenario time. All right. So let's talk about how you can stay in your lane. I would like a volunteer to read the scenario that's on the screen.
I'll do it.
Go ahead.
Your nonprofit is preparing for a major event. The executive director and staff have a clear plan, but some board members start giving input on logistics, suggesting vendors, changing the marketing approach, and stepping in to oversee event planning. Other board members feel this is not their role, but are unsure how to address it.
I really did not choose this based on our conversation, but this is the scenario that I came up with prior to today's session. So what should happen next?
The executive director should refer back to that slide that I want us to have a copy of and come into the board meeting and explain to us that what we want to do is management and that what we need to be doing is governance. Ashley, I got you on this one.
You're going to be like my phone a friend, Yolanda, so get ready.
Anybody else?
I'm wondering about the other board members that are feeling like this is not their role, but unsure of how to address it. I think that they have to speak up. That's part. I have that written down, right? Like accountability.
Mm-hmm. So what do you all think is the board's role in supporting major initiatives like events, fundraising, or programs?
No, I think the board member can actually ask pertinent question. I mean, the executive director is going to come with a clear plan of what she and her team, but then the board member could ask questions like, what are the vendors? Have you explored the different vendors? Do you have vendor A, vendor B? How did you get to this conclusion to choose this vendor? Ask intentional questions like those. But at the end of the day, the plan is hers. It's our responsibility to make sure that she have actually executed all those different, the best vendor to meet the alliance budget.
So Maylene brought up something that I think is a conversation that I didn't necessarily think about having, but I think as we've had this, hold on, switch to the school bus just dropped my son off, so I have enjoyed not using switch to the headphones. He just walked in. So, I think one of the things that I would recommend for that situation is, and especially because I know a little since I've been working with you all about the Alliance, is I would recommend to you, if there are board members who are not feeling like they can speak up, I think it's important for you all as a board to have a board charter and to talk about what communication looks like. And so is there an opportunity to talk about how do we communicate as a board? How do we hold each other accountable? How can board members provide feedback to each other? But on even at a bigger level, if you as a board member feels like a fellow board member is not being heard, what may you do? And so talking about what that looks like, how do you provide support? And so a lot of times for boards, I do recommend going through like a communications training annually, especially if you're bringing on new board members, so everybody understands how each other communicate. So that when you do see a board member who's maybe not participating, sometimes it might just be their mode of communication. But in terms of this scenario in particular, and them feeling unsure and how to address it, you might also think about talking about your own expectations as a board around fundraising and having a covenant around that. Like, what are your expectations as a board for fundraising? Some boards have an expectation that each board member each year they have a giving policy. So they're expected to raise $1,500 a year. And that raising $1,500 may look like A, B, C, D. But having some of those clear directions as a board, I think would be important for you. But in terms of this scenario, that peer accountability would be important, and having clear expectations. Go ahead, Yolanda.
So, Dr. Keisha, let me go back to something you mentioned about how we communicate. And I'll just give another observation. I know that that's not my problem. Let me first be transparent with that. I know how to say what I need to say. But I recognize that even on our board, we have people who don't talk a lot. We have a lot of different things that we're discussing. I would like for you to say more about the communication part, because one of the things I thought about when we had our 5-minute break is, as a new board member, I think that, well, let me say this, what I've learned that has been very insightful for me is that we've gone from a working board to now trying to transition into governance. I'll use some language we said in one of our other meetings. I would like for us to tell our historical story better as a board, right? Because I'm inquisitive, so I've reached out to people, I've made phone calls. I'm like, because base camp is overstimulating for me. I can't use it because there's too many things happening at one time, and I get lost in the sauce. Just full transparency. But with the communication part, I would like to have known that we are going from a working board to a governance board, because then when I'm sitting in the meetings and there are certain questions that are coming up for me, to know that we're still in that transition, I find that information very helpful. So I don't know how helpful that would be for other new board members to know, since our language is the crisis, right? Since the crisis, this is what happened. We were reactionary. Now we're trying to move into governance. I would like our story to be packaged a little bit better, because I would have found that very helpful.
And so remember I talked about that language change? Maybe you do have a focus session on how do you talk about the crisis. So everybody has the same message. So sometimes you do trainings on the elevator speech to help you to fundraise. I think because that crisis was so monumental for you as an organization, you need to have shared a language around how to talk about it, instead of it constantly being the elephant in the room. Thoughts around that?
Dr. Keisha, why are you disappearing into your virtual background, or is that just me?
Oh, it might be my camera. Ooh. Maybe it doesn't want me to show my face again. Let's see. Is it because I sat back too far? Wow, you're sensitive. I didn't even see that. I think it's because I sat back too far.
Okay, now I see you. I like to look at people when they talking.
Listen, it's one of those things, the camera and a Black woman experience in the virtual space. Yeah, I'll own that one today. So I disappeared into my background. Okay. All right. Okay. So, and so as a governing board, what is the board's role in supporting major initiatives like events, fundraising, or programs? That is something for you to think about and expectations around that, especially because you're such a large board. There's some things that go in line with being a governing board and some things that go in line with being a working board. But as Yolanda mentioned, you guys are transitioning. So even having conversations around that, what that looks like during transition may be helpful. And then when you think about providing strategic guidance without getting involved in daily execution, what does that look like? So you get more involved when you don't have enough information. And so that's why sometimes there are layers. So as an executive, your executive director now needs to understand how to prepare to present to her board. What kinds of information is my board going to want to know? And so when she's packaging that in a way that is received well. She may have some conversations prior to the meeting. There may also be some layers. So maybe she's working with the board chair prior to the meeting so that she's prepared to get in front of the board chairs, the entire board. Because then maybe some of the questions that the board chair is asking prior to the meeting is helpful. So in some organizations, they actually have the executive director meeting with the board chair prior to the meeting. That way they're on the same page, but that board chair is also giving valuable feedback to the executive director to get her prepared to come in front of the board. And I know you all also have a vice chair and you have an executive committee. So sort of how are you using those layers to better prepare you to have effective board meetings? Because really the board meetings because of how you all are structured with your subcommittees and everything else, it should make your board meetings move quicker. Because a lot of your planning and your more in-depth work should be happening at committee. Thoughts? And I will remember to provide you with that slide, Yolanda. You are going to get the whole slide deck though. So we talked a little bit about what oversight and management looks like. This is that famous slide that Yolanda wants another one of. And so we'll make sure that you get that. Why is it going back? Okay. All right. So the key takeaways from this is that you all as a governing board is focused on governance, not execution. The board should focus on high-level strategy, policy, and accountability rather than implementation details. When I worked at a previous job, one of the first things I would do with my supervisor when I was getting ready to present in front of the board is I would sit with her so she could go through stuff because you know what? I was an oversharer. And she used to always tell me, you share more, they ask more. So here's exactly what I need you to say. Because if you start going down that road, they're going to start going down that rabbit hole with you. Support versus interference. Board members can ask strategic questions, help make connections, and provide oversight, but should not take on staff roles. There's a very clear line with that. Trust leadership. The executive director and staff are responsible for carrying out the board's vision. The board's role is to empower, not override. Staying in your lane is extremely hard. This is how you can provide oversight and strategy while trusting leadership can handle daily execution. Ask insightful, big picture questions. Provide support without micromanaging. And finally, make decisions that drive the nonprofit's long-term success. Any thoughts or questions? All right. So there are different kinds of boards, and we sort of talked about that earlier. And so when you think about it, you have an advisory board that provides guidance and expertise, but no governing authority. Then you have your working board. You're actively involved in operations and program execution. You have the governing board. You're focusing on oversight, strategy, and policy setting. Then you have the policy board, primarily sets high-level policies and delegates operations. And sometimes you have what's known as a hybrid board. It's a mix of governance and hands-on involvement, depending on the stage of the nonprofit. And so you all might be sitting in a certain space right now based on where you are. What are the factors that influence the type of board? The structure and function of a nonprofit board depends on several key factors. Those are organization size and complexity, stage of organizational development, mission and programs, and in some instances, legal and regulatory requirements. So for you all, I think about your my-aim relationship and how that might impact the type of governing board, the type of board that you are. So now for some fun. Let us take some time. I want to hear from you. If you can use your phone to scan that QR code or go to that website, what kind of board do you think you are? And the cool thing about this is nobody will know who said what. This is also my first time using this from within Canva, so let's see how it works.
It's making me sign in.
I'll see.
Yeah, it asked me to sign in too.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, we won't be doing that. See, that's good to know. Okay. Give me a second. So you shouldn't, I thought it worked fine. You got a free break. All right. Can you guys see it? You guys should be able to vote. We're waiting on one person to vote.
Yeah, Dr. Gray, because you made me a co-host, it's not letting me vote it. I'm able to see the poll results, so I think everybody voted.
Okay. Awesome. All right. So it looks like we have a split between working board and governing board. Actually, I'm going to put you on the spot. Where would you vote?
I most days see us in a working board spot.
Awesome. So again, and even just throwing Ashley in as like a round, like just to help to break the tie. You're seeing that a number of you think that you are still operating as a working board. And so that is something for you to think about. What does that mean for the organization, and how are you operationalizing the work that you're doing? There was no right or wrong answer. It was just really just to help you to get a test to see where people are. The right type of board evolves based on your mission, your growth stage, your funding, your leadership capacity. Boards must assess their role and structure regularly to ensure they're effectively supporting the organization's long-term success. So that might be somewhere where you guys are, and that might be a good place to be at. Any thoughts? Guys have gone quiet on me again. All right. So now we were supposed to go into another case study, but I think we've pretty much we've discussed almost everything that I could come up with. This next case study was around a nonprofit board struggling to define its role within the organization. While its members are dedicated and engaged, there's confusion about whether the primary function is strategic oversight or active involvement in daily operations. Some board members feel like they should have hands-on support, while others feel like the board should focus on governance and policy making. And so I do have a workbook that's going to come back to you. This is included in that workbook. I would suggest that maybe as a board, you have a conversation specifically around this, and maybe you work through this activity to sort of see where you all would fall as the standing board right now. Any thoughts? So you would focus those questions are what are the characteristics of a governing board versus a working board? How can the board ensure it maintains a strategic oversight role rather than engaging in daily operations? And then what policies or structures should be reinforced to align with intended governance model? And we started to talk about some of those things. Like Ashley asked a very good question. And so it's really being pointed as you move forward with how you're setting up meetings, what information you're getting to really help you to move in the direction that you want to move. Here's some best practices. So for your board meetings, sticking with your structured agendas, making sure that you have active participation, aligning your board work with mission priorities, training, onboarding. Kudos to Ashley and you all as a team for spending so much time into onboarding this year. Like, it feels very different. If you were a returning board member that didn't necessarily have this, it may feel a little bit different. But as a new member who's gotten this opportunity, now you may want more. And that's an okay space to be. So making sure that you're continuing to evolve with training, because that's how you're going to get to the place that you want to be as a board. But make sure that you're also continuously evaluating your training. And the support that I provide, I make sure that you all are continuing to do those things. But don't just do the evaluation. You have to look at the data and make informed decisions based on what you're learning. So next steps. As you all have thought about this training, what action will you take to improve governance after this training? If you want to share. If not, I want you to take some moments and think about this now.
I think my suggestion for our next steps would be, one, to go into to have a special meeting where all we're going to talk about is the crisis, like to put language around that, to explain that our executive director, our president, I think our vice president, maybe even our treasurer are people that literally found themselves thrown into these spaces. I think that needs to be said explicitly. I think there's been an attempt to communicate what the crisis is, but I would be more interested in what the reaction was to the crisis. Like, there's been language around the financial stuff and all of that, the mime stuff, but what has been the reaction? Because I think as a new board member, I am walking through the murk and the mire of the reactionary part, right? I think once the narrative is created, then I think there needs to be a conversation around what thoughts have been given to moving from the working board to the governance board, like explaining to us what the transition is as we're moving towards that. And I think the third thing is to do some of the pieces that we've done in this training by providing scenarios where we see clearly. I love to stay in your lane, right? And then that would perhaps open us up to more conversation about the differences between the working board and the governance board, to show us explicitly how we keep vacillating between the two. I'm thinking about a meeting we were in, and we started off with one point, and then the conversation went to the other side, and then we never got back to the original point, and then there were even thoughts of taking things back to redo what we've already done. And I think part of what that is this lack of clarity between working board and governance. So if we did a stay in your lane exercise, then that would then open up for more dialogue. And then finally, creating an agreement where as a board, we come out of every meeting with actionable items. Like, what are we doing? What should we be doing during the month? And when we come back next month, what do you expect us to already do? So I would like to have a board meeting specifically with what I just shared as that agenda.
Go ahead, Ashley.
I just wanted to piggyback on what Yolanda said about that last piece, and even like this whole. So if half of the board members here feel like we are governing and half here feel like we are working, I feel that every day. So if we can imagine 19 people have 50-50, half of the board members call me on the phone and say, Ashley, we're a governing board. Why are you doing this? The other half are calling me on the phone and saying, Ashley, do more. Ask me to do more. I can help you. We're a working board. And so I do, and I've said this to you, Dr. Gray, like, I think the board has to have this conversation, because me being the receiver of it and trying to say, like, well, we're working towards this and this and this and this, like, it isn't, the board hasn't had the conversation, so they're not wrestling with it and then kind of coming to a group consensus around, like, the way that you've been able to in this meeting today, Yolanda, like, really feel like, oh, we kind of have 1 foot here and 1 foot here, and that's why I feel this tension. Like, I think it's just really important to be able to do that with the whole group. Or I truly feel like I'm being pulled in both directions, but I'm just one person and I'm not on the board, and I'm not then the one having this conversation.
Dr. Hutchinson?
Yeah, I think it's a deeper conversation like that than that. I think this presentation, I hope it's been recorded so the entire board could understand what is a governing board, because like Ashley said, they vacillate back and forth. Because there have been instances when I say, guys, don't forget, this is, are we a governing board or a working board? So that's where my frustration come in, to be honest with you, because I don't think all the board members are on board to know what a working board is. But I think also, to Yolanda's point, the crisis has actually put us into this position where we're flipping back and forth, because there are times when it's like peeling onions, when we go full force into governance and then all of a sudden, oh my God, this needs to be done. So we go back into that working board mode. So I guess I'm thinking maybe we're not ready to be a governing board yet until we are actually stabilized from this crisis. That's something for us to be thinking about.
Mm, that's interesting. And that's definitely something I think you all should explore. Explore. I just said implore. So some of my recommended next steps for you all is the needs assessment survey is out. And I can't wait to continue to learn from that. So encourage your fellow board members to complete it, because I will be presenting on that. To think about implementing a strategic governance plan. And so that does look like starting where you all have identified you need to start. And so, following Robert's rules and going to your next board meeting and making recommendations, and seeing where your fellow board members align with that would be a nice, natural next step. Developing a board member code of conduct. That might also be helpful to help you. Review and update your governance documents. I know you all are continuing to work through your bylaws. I have some recommendations that I'm going to share with Ashley later on this week. And so again, just continuing. A lot of times when I'm working with organizations, they struggle with accepting that this is a good place to be at and to giving yourself kudos because you're spending the time to do the work. Because sometimes people want actions and they think it's going to be solved very quickly, but at least you're recognizing that you have some key things to do and you're committed to doing it. So rather than continuing to do things the quick way, I continue to encourage you to sit where you are and work through this. As Yolanda called it, I'm probably butchering your name and I apologize. I'm originally from Jamaica and I butcher everybody's name. My girlfriend tells me every single day. She's like, just don't call names. Don't use names because you butcher names. But, I just really encourage you all to sit where you are. Kudos for the work that you're doing. Continue spending this time and the growth will happen. The growth will happen. Effective governance does not stop at training. It requires ongoing reflection, assessment, and like Yolanda said today, action. What are those action items? I encourage you to keep moving forward with me today. My cell phone number is on here. Feel free to reach out, my website, as well as my email address. Ashley is the point